My name is Madison Hale, and my entire life began with a loss I couldn't yet comprehend. My father was 28 when he died. I was only 4. He was returning home late one evening after work. The road was wet from the rain, and a truck swerved into the oncoming lane, killing him. I learned this much later. As a child, I was simply told, "Daddy's in heaven now." I have little left of my father. A few photographs of him laughing and hugging me, an old jacket smelling of motor oil, and a short video recorded on an ancient camera. In it, he holds me in his arms, twirls me around the room, and says, "My little star." I knew that voice better than his face. Sometimes it seemed I remembered him not with my mind, but with my body, as a feeling of safety, as a warmth that vanished too soon. After his death, my mother and I were left alone. Linda Hale changed dramatically. She became different, anxious, irritable, as if constantly afraid the world would take something away from her again. She couldn't be alone. And very quickly, men began appearing in our house. They came and went, leaving no trace except loud voices and the unpleasant feeling that I was in the way. One liked to boss me around, another liked to drink, a third pretended I didn't exist. Mom always believed he was the one. She was always wrong. Our house in the San Bernardino suburbs was never a peaceful place. I learned early on to distinguish footsteps in the hallway, the intonation of voices, the slamming of doors. I knew when it was best to lock myself in a room and not come out, and when it was okay to quietly slip into the kitchen for a glass of water. The only real salvation was my grandmother, Eleanor, my mother's mother. She lived in a small house with a neat garden and a porch that always smelled of freshly baked goods. When things became too difficult in our house, Grandma seemed to sense it from a distance. "Maddie, pack your things," she'd say, appearing on the threshold. "Let's go to my place." It was truly quiet at Grandma's. The silence didn't oppress. It was healing. We baked pies, read books, tended to the flowers. She never raised her voice and always listened to me as if my words mattered. With her, I became a child again. Sometimes I asked about my father's parents. I wondered why I didn't have a second grandmother, a second grandfather. "They turn their backs on us," Mom would reply sharply. "After your father died, they had no time for us." There was always anger in her voice. Back then, I believed it. Later, I realized Mom often didn't tell the truth, but rather what was convenient for her. School became my refuge. Everything was clear there, the rules, the assignments, the grades. I tried to do well in school, not for praise. It was simply the only thing I could control. Teachers were often amazed at my independence. They didn't know that by the age of 10, I could already cook dinner, wash my clothes, and grade my own homework. My mother showed little interest in my life. She was busy with her own, searching for love, which always eluded her. When I turned 12, my mother announced she was getting married. She beamed like in a movie. "His name is Richard Coleman," she said. "Everything will be different now." I wanted to believe. I really did. Richard appeared in our house confidently, as if he'd always lived here. He was tall, silent, and looked at me as if I were an annoying misunderstanding. That very first evening, when my mother left the room, he leaned toward me and quietly said, "You're in the way here. Don't bother me, and there won't be any problems."
I didn't answer then.
I just nodded. It was at that moment that I realized my childhood was over. That night, I couldn't sleep for a long time. I heard my mother laughing in the next room, and for the first time, I felt like there was no place for me in this house anymore. I clutched an old photograph of my father to my chest and whispered, "Dad, if you can hear me, please don't let me perish." I didn't yet know that years of pain, humiliation, and loneliness lay ahead. But I also didn't know something else, that the truth would inevitably find its way out, and that this house, where I felt like an outsider, actually held a secret that could change my life. After my mother and Richard's wedding, the house seemed to shrink. The walls, which had once been simply cold, now began to oppress. The air became heavier, and every step I took became more cautious. Richard established new rules almost immediately, and they were non-negotiable. "There's order in this house," he said at dinner, placing his fork next to his plate. "And everyone should know their place." I already knew my place. From that day on, I had to get up before everyone else. Clean the kitchen, take out the trash, check that the windows were closed. Any little thing could become a cause for discontent. If something was wrong, Richard didn't immediately yell. He'd stare long and hard, then speak quietly, which made it even more frightening. "Do you think someone is obligated to support you here?" he'd ask, as if arguing with himself. "You're wrong." Mom almost always sided with him. If I tried to explain something, she'd sigh and say, "Madison, don't provoke him. He just wants order." Order meant one thing to me: silence. My room became both a refuge and a prison. I tried to spend as much time there as possible, pretending to study. In reality, I just sat on my bed and listened to what was going on in the house, so I knew when it was safe to leave. At school, I became even more withdrawn. My clothes were worn, and my phone was an old push-button phone my grandmother had given me. But to my surprise, my classmates didn't laugh. On the contrary, they sometimes helped. "Maddie, do you want to come with us?" Claire, a girl in my class, would ask when her mother picked her up after school. I always agreed, because no one was waiting for me at home. Richard believed I had to earn my living. He kept track of my expenses in a notebook. Food, notebooks, school uniform, everything was recorded. "It's your debt," he'd say. "When you grow up, you'll pay it back." I couldn't understand how a child could be in debt simply for living. Grades became another form of control. Excellent was the norm. Good was grounds for punishment. 87%. He looked at my math test. That's not perfect. Television was banned. Weekends were questionable. Meetings with friends were rare. But the hardest blow was the ban on visiting my grandmother. Richard quickly realized that it was the only place where I felt safe. "You don't deserve it," he'd say with a cold smile. "You'll be home, studying." When my grandmother called, I lied. I'd smile into the phone and say I had a lot of homework. I couldn't bring myself to tell the truth. I was afraid he'd ban me from seeing her altogether. By 14, I stopped feeling like a child. I felt like a function.
Cleaning. Studying.
Silence. Sometimes at night, I'd pull out videos of my father and watch them with the sound turned off, so no one would hear. I felt like if he were alive, none of this would have happened. He would have protected me. At 15, I decided I needed an outlet, even if it was just a little one. I got a job at a diner near the school. When I mentioned it at home, Richard unexpectedly approved. "Time to make a difference," he said. Work became my salvation. The diner owner, Martha, treated me warmly. She'd ask how my day was, let me leave early on weekends. "You're a good girl, Maddie," she'd say, "and too serious for your age." I started visiting my grandmother more often. Those hours were like a breath of fresh air. I never told her everything. I cherished her. By the time I was 17, a quiet hope had begun to bloom within me. I thought, when I turn 18, everything will change. They'll finally recognize me as an adult. They'll stop controlling me. I even naively dreamed that on my birthday, my mother would hug me and tell me she was proud of me. I was wrong. I didn't yet know that my 18th birthday would not be the beginning of a new life, but a point of no return, and that the truth, hidden for many years, would come to light precisely when I would be left homeless. I'd imagined my 18th birthday in many different ways, but none of them involved me finding myself with my bag by the door and feeling like I'd just been erased from my own life. When I woke up that morning, I lay there for a long time, staring at the ceiling. It was a strange feeling. Not joy, not fear, but a tense anticipation, as if something was about to happen. I dressed especially neatly. It was the only outfit I considered truly festive, a simple light dress from a thrift store and an old cardigan. I styled my hair, took a deep breath, and left the room. Mom and Richard were sitting in the kitchen. No cake, no balloons, not even a happy birthday. "You're finally awake," Mom said in a calm, detached voice. "We need to talk." My heart sank. "I'm pregnant," she continued, as if reporting the weather. "We'll need your room. You can go wherever you want, but you won't live here anymore." I stood there, confused by the words. They sounded too calm, too casual. "But today is my birthday," I whispered, "and this is my home." Mom looked up sharply. "This is my home," she said coldly, "and you've been a problem for too long. I need peace." Richard was silent, but his gaze was full of satisfaction. "Where should I go?" I asked. Mom shrugged. "To Grandma's. Or anywhere. We don't have money for college, so you're on your own. But you have to come and help around the house while Richard is at work. I can't overexert myself." She thrust a bag into my hands. It contained a few clothes and some old sneakers. The door closed behind me with a dull click. I walked toward Grandma's house, my legs numb. The world seemed to have gone gray. I wasn't crying. I'd simply run out of tears. Grandma opened the door almost immediately, as if she'd been waiting for me. "Madison, happy birthday, my girl," she said, then noticed my bag and my face. "What happened?" I burst into tears on her shoulder. She didn't interrupt. She just held me tight. "You're always home," she said when I'd calmed down a bit. "Always." The kitchen smelled of fresh cookies. Grandma set a plate in front of me and poured milk. "We won't be sad today," she said. "You deserve a celebration." An hour later, my school friends were already in the yard. Laughter, music, simple gifts. I felt needed. For the first time, truly. At some point, I heard Grandma talking on the phone. Quietly but confidently.
Yes.
"It's time. Tomorrow morning will be best." The next day, there was a knock on the door. It was Mom. "Madison," she said, unexpectedly softly. "Forgive me. I understand everything. Come home." She handed me the gift. Grandma came closer. "I'm afraid you're late, Linda." At that moment, an elderly man and woman entered the house. "Madison," the woman smiled. "We're grandparents on your father's side." The world turned upside down. They told me the truth. The house I lived in belonged to me. My father left it to me, and they put it in my name. My mother was allowed to live there until I came of age. "We also sent money every month," my grandfather said, "for your upkeep and for college." I looked at my mother. She was silent. "We spent it all," she finally whispered. I stood up. "You stole my life," I said quietly. "Now go away." In that moment, I realized I was no longer a victim. After that morning, my grandmother's house ceased to be just a refuge. It became a headquarters. At the kitchen table, where we used to drink tea and discuss books, now lay folders of documents, copies of certificates, statements, and letters. I looked at it all as if it were someone else's life, not believing they were talking about me. My paternal grandparents, Robert and Marion Hale, acted calmly and clearly. There was no hysteria in their voices, only determination. "We've been silent for too long," Robert said. "This won't happen again." Lawyers explained, judges asked questions, papers passed from hand to hand. I signed the documents with a trembling hand. Each time I signed, I seemed to confirm, yes, all this happened to me. And yes, I have a right to justice. The hardest part was filing the eviction lawsuit. Even after everything I'd been through, there was still a little girl inside me who hoped my mother would come to her senses. "You're not breaking up the family," Grandma Eleanor said softly. "You're no longer a victim." Mom and Richard came to court together. She looked tired but unrepentant. Richard was cold and irritated. When the judge read the decision, I could barely breathe. "The court recognizes Madison Hale's ownership." The words rang out like a release. "The defendants are ordered to return the funds intended for the plaintiff's education and to vacate the property." Mom jumped up. "She's ungrateful," she screamed. "I gave her the best years of my life,"
he said quietly.
For the first time, her words didn't hurt. A month later, the house was empty. I walked in alone. Dust, empty closets, a broken shelf. I opened the windows and let in the air. This house was no longer a cage. My grandmother and I cleared it out slowly, as if erasing the past. Every discarded item was a step forward. We managed to get some of the money back. But most importantly, college became possible. I applied to the University of Oregon and received my acceptance letter. That evening, I sat on the porch of my grandmother's house and watched the sunset. "You did it," she said. I smiled. For the first time, without fear. The day of departure arrived unnoticed. It seemed like only yesterday I was sitting at my grandmother's kitchen table, afraid to look up, and today there were neatly stacked boxes of my things in the room, and a plane ticket to Eugene, Oregon, lay on the nightstand next to the phone. I'd gotten in. The words still sounded unreal in my head. In the morning, Grandma Eleanor made breakfast as if it were any other day, but I saw her hands tremble as she set the cups on the table. "Don't worry," I said, hugging her. "I'll call every day." "I know," she replied, stroking my hair. "It's just that now you're truly moving on with your life." The house that had once been a symbol of fear was now mine. We decided that Grandma would look after it while I went to school. Before leaving, I walked through the rooms. Each one no longer brought pain, only memories and a sense of completion. My dad's parents drove me to university. The car was quiet, but it was a good silence. "Your father would be proud of you," Grandpa Robert said as we pulled up to campus. The dorm smelled of fresh paint and a new beginning. I unpacked, hung my father's photo on the wall, and placed the watch my grandparents had given me on the desk. It was engraved with the phrase, "Truth always returns." College turned out to be a completely different world. Here, no one demanded silence out of fear. Here, opinions were valued, questions were asked, and people listened. I enrolled in psychology and social work courses. I wanted to understand people and help those who felt lost. I worked part-time at the library, joined a volunteer club, and for the first time, I allowed myself to dream without guilt. Sometimes in the evenings, I still dreamed of the old house, but now in these dreams, I always opened the windows. I hardly heard about my mother. I only knew that she had given birth to a girl and moved to another state. Sometimes I felt sorry for my half-sister. I hoped she would have a different fate. But I no longer felt responsible for the choices adults made. One fall, I received a letter. No return address. Inside was a short note. "I don't know how to be a mother, but Maybe you'll be stronger without me. I folded it and put it in a drawer.
It was goodbye.
And that was enough. On Thanksgiving, I returned to my grandmother's. The house was warm, cozy, filled with the smell of pie. We sat at the table, laughing, reminiscing. I looked at the people around me and understood. Family isn't about who's related by blood, but who stays. That evening, I went out onto the porch and looked at the stars. "I did it, Dad," I whispered. And for the first time in my life, I was sure it was true.